Sometimes the universe doesn't kill people right away. Sometimes it leaves them drifting in the dark, waiting to see if anyone still cares enough to come back for them. The storm outside the cockpit looked like liquid fire. Blue ion clouds rolled across the shattered sector in slow motion, flashing against Ethan Cole's windshield every few seconds like distant lightning beneath deep water. His salvaged ship, the Rust Sparrow, groaned under the pressure as another wave of electromagnetic interference rattled the hull plating. Warning lights flickered red across the cramped cockpit. The stale smell of overheated wiring filled the air. Ethan tightened one hand around the manual controls while the other held a half-finished cup of cold coffee that had stopped tasting like coffee hours ago. "Easy, easy," he muttered as the ship drifted between the broken carcasses of old freighters and shattered mining platforms floating through Sector 12. The graveyard stretched for miles in every direction. Twisted metal, frozen cargo containers, pieces of forgotten wars. Most scavengers avoided ion storms this strong. Ethan preferred them. Fewer competitors, better scraps, worse odds. That usually meant better pay. The Rust Sparrow's radar emitted a soft ping. Then another. Ethan glanced toward the cracked side monitor. A signal was pushing through the static. Weak, inconsistent, ancient. He frowned. That's not possible. The signal repeated again beneath layers of interference. Not a beacon, not military, not automated. A voice, faint enough to sound almost imaginary. Ethan reached over and adjusted the receiver manually. Static burst through the speakers. Then silence. Then a child's voice quietly emerged from the noise. "Mom." Ethan froze. The ion storm crackled outside the cockpit glass. "Mom, it's cold." The transmission looped. Distorted. Fragile. Like it had been bouncing through dead space for months. Ethan slowly lowered the coffee cup. Jesus. He checked the timestamp twice. The signal origin belonged to the Crescent Dawn, a civilian transport vessel that vanished 14 months ago near the edge of Cerelia Prime territory. He remembered hearing about it on station news feeds back then. Reactor failure during evacuation routes after the border conflicts. Hundreds dead. No survivors recovered. Search operations ended after 11 days. Ethan stared at the speaker as the child's voice repeated again through static. Softer this time. "Mom." Something tightened in his chest. He hated that feeling. The Rust Sparrow drifted deeper into the debris field while the storm flashed around him in cold blue bursts. His scanner finally located the source, roughly 300 yards ahead, wedged between the broken remains of a cargo hauler and a drifting communications array. Ethan leaned forward. At first he thought it was debris. Then another lightning flash illuminated the object spinning slowly through the dark. An escape pod. Small. Civilian-grade. Half covered in frozen ice crystals. "No way," he whispered. Every rational part of his brain told him to leave it alone. Old pods sometimes carried unstable batteries. Radiation leaks. Corpses. Sometimes worse. Salvagers who chased ghosts usually ended up becoming ghosts themselves. But then the voice came again. Tiny. Trembling. "Please." Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. "Yeah," he muttered quietly while pulling the ship closer. That's usually how this starts. The Rust Sparrow's docking clamps locked onto the pod with a heavy metallic thunk that vibrated through the hull. Warning alarms immediately lit across Ethan's console. Cryo support failure. Life support critical. Internal temperature, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Ethan's jaw tightened. Damn. He grabbed his thermal jacket from the seat behind him and pulled it on fast. The corridor lights inside the ship flickered as he moved toward the airlock. Hydraulic doors hissed open. Cold air spilled into the narrow passage ahead like the breath of deep space itself. The pod sat attached to the docking ring outside the inner hatch, covered in frost so thick it looked buried in winter. Ethan stepped closer carefully. His flashlight beam swept across faded registry numbers beneath the ice. Crescent Dawn. His stomach sank. The voice was still playing softly from somewhere inside. Not from the radio now. From the pod itself. "Mom." Ethan placed one gloved hand against the frozen surface. For a moment, all he could hear was the hum of failing machinery and the distant rumble of the ion storm outside the ship. Then came a weak sound from within the pod. A tiny cough. Ethan's expression changed instantly. "Oh no," he breathed. "You're alive." The pod door resisted him at first. Frost cracked beneath Ethan's gloves while emergency latches groaned somewhere deep inside the mechanism. The Rust Sparrow's dim corridor lights reflected off the ice, coating the surface in pale blue streaks. Warning alarms continued pulsing overhead in slow intervals. Oxygen critical. Cryosystem unstable. Ethan ignored all of it and forced the manual release lever downward with both hands. A violent hiss burst from the seams as freezing vapor poured into the docking corridor. The temperature dropped instantly. Ethan's breath fogged inside the narrow passage while the pod doors slowly opened 3 inches at a time. "Come on," he muttered through clenched teeth. Another hydraulic groan echoed through the hull. Then the door finally slid open. Cold air rolled out, like winter escaping from a tomb. Inside the pod, a small figure lay curled beneath layers of silver emergency blankets. Tiny blue fingers clutched a stuffed animal against her chest so tightly the fabric had nearly torn apart. Ethan stopped moving for half a second. The child could not have been older than 8. Her skin carried the soft turquoise hue common to cerulean bloodlines, though now it looked pale beneath the flickering cryo lights. White strands of hair stuck against her cheeks from melted frost. Tiny ice crystals clung to her eyelashes. The pod's medical monitor flickered weakly beside her. Heart rate unstable. Body temperature dangerously low. Ethan immediately dropped to one knee beside the chamber. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey, kid. Stay with me." Her eyes barely opened. Golden irises reflected the emergency lights dimly before drifting shut again. "Mom," she whispered. Ethan swallowed hard. Not exactly. He carefully removed his thermal jacket and wrapped it around her small shoulders. The girl trembled violently the second the warmer air touched her skin. The stuffed animal slipped slightly from her hands. It was some kind of faded cloth creature with long ears and one missing eye. Burn marks darkened one side of it. Ethan activated the portable heater attached to his belt and placed it beside the pod. Warm air slowly filled the corridor. "Okay," he murmured while checking the failing cryo unit. "Okay, we are not dying tonight. That is the plan." The pod logs began scrolling automatically across the damaged monitor screen. Evacuation failure. Primary engine collapse. Escape pod ejection authorized. Passenger ID, LYSS Veolira. Ethan frowned immediately at the surname. Veolira, he repeated quietly. Even scavengers at the edge of civilized space knew that name. House Veolira controlled nearly half the cerulean trade routes beyond the mid-systems. Old bloodline. Royal connections. Political power everywhere. Ethan looked back down at the unconscious child wrapped inside his jacket. "Well," he sighed softly. "That complicates things." Another weak cough escaped her lips. Ethan moved quickly. He lifted her carefully from the cryo chamber, surprised by how little she weighed. The child instinctively curled against his chest for warmth without fully waking up. Her forehead rested against the collar of his shirt while tiny shivers ran through her body. Ethan carried her through the corridor toward the ship's small medical bay. The Rust Sparrow vibrated as another wave of ion turbulence struck the hull outside. Sparks briefly jumped from one of the ceiling panels. Yeah, Ethan muttered toward the ship. "I know this is a terrible idea." The medical bay barely deserved the name. One narrow cot, 2 supply drawers, a flickering diagnostic scanner that only worked when it felt motivated. Ethan laid the child down gently and pulled another thermal blanket over her. The scanner emitted several irritated beeps before finally stabilizing. Severe dehydration, cryoexhaustion, mild oxygen deprivation. No major internal injuries. Ethan exhaled slowly for what felt like the first time in minutes. "Lucky kid," he whispered. The girl stirred weakly beneath the blankets. Her small hand reached blindly across the cot until it found the sleeve of Ethan's shirt. She held onto it immediately. Tight, like letting go might send her back into the dark again. Ethan looked down at her hand for several silent seconds. Then he leaned back in the chair beside the cot with a tired sigh while emergency lights painted the room red and blue around them. Outside the ship, the ion storm continued swallowing the stars. The Rust Sparrow drifted out of the ion storm 3 hours later with scorch marks crawling across its left engine, housing, and half the navigation panel flickering like a dying neon sign. Ethan sat slouched in the cockpit with one boot propped against the console while steam curled from another cup of burnt coffee beside him. Outside the windshield, the blackness of deep space finally looked calm again. No lightning, no debris storms, just distant stars stretched across endless dark. Behind him, soft footsteps padded carefully across the corridor floor. Ethan glanced toward the reflection in the cockpit glass before turning around fully. LYSS stood near the doorway wrapped almost completely inside his oversized thermal jacket. The sleeves covered her hands entirely. Her silver-white hair looked messy from sleep, sticking out unevenly around her small face. She stared at him cautiously with wide golden eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound came from the low hum of the ship's aging engines. Ethan slowly lowered his coffee cup. "Well," he said quietly, "that is usually a good sign. Dead people do not sneak around hallways." Lyss blinked once. "You talk strange." Ethan nodded seriously. "I have been told that by professionals." A tiny flicker of confusion crossed her face before disappearing again. She looked exhausted more than frightened now. Ethan noticed the stuffed animal tucked tightly beneath one arm. She had not let go of it once. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Lyss hesitated before answering. "Warm." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "That makes one of us." The child stepped farther into the cockpit while studying everything around her with careful curiosity. Her gaze moved across the cracked control screens, hanging cables, old coffee stains, and duct-taped ceiling panels. "Your ship looks tired," she whispered. Ethan looked around slowly. "That is because my ship and I are in a committed relationship." Lyss stared at him for another second before a faint smile finally appeared. Small, fragile, but real. Ethan felt something inside his chest loosen slightly at the sight of it. Then the girl's expression faded again as she looked toward the stars outside the windshield. "How long was I sleeping?" Ethan checked the medical display on the side monitor. "Approximately 14 months. Silence settled heavily inside the cockpit. Lyss did not react immediately. She simply stared ahead at the darkness beyond the glass while her small fingers tightened around the stuffed animal. "Oh," she whispered at last. Ethan watched her carefully. Most adults broke apart hearing news like that. The child only looked tired. Tired in a way no kid should ever look. "Do you remember anything?" he asked gently. Lyss nodded slowly. There was smoke in the hallways. Her voice became distant. The lights kept turning red. "Mommy was carrying me." Ethan stayed quiet. People were screaming. She swallowed hard. Then the ship started shaking. The cockpit seemed smaller suddenly. The soft engine hummed louder. Lyss stared down at the stuffed animal in her hands. One tiny thumb rubbed absent-mindedly across the burned fabric. "Mommy put me in the pod because I was scared." Her voice cracked slightly for the first time. "She said she would be right behind me." Ethan looked away toward the windshield for a moment. Deep space reflected faintly across the tired lines of his face. "Parents say things like that," he murmured quietly. Lyss lifted her eyes toward him. "Did she lie?" The question hit harder than Ethan expected. He rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw while searching for an answer that did not sound empty. "No," he said finally. "I do not think she did." The child remained silent for several seconds. Then she asked the question Ethan had been dreading since the moment he opened the pod. "Is my mommy dead?" The old salvage ship creaked softly around them, while distant stars drifted beyond the cockpit glass like frozen lanterns. Ethan looked at the little girl standing inside his jacket with exhaustion in her eyes and hope hanging by a thread in her voice. He chose his next words carefully. "I do not know," he admitted. "But I know one thing." Lyss waited silently. Ethan reached forward and adjusted the navigation controls toward the Cerulean trade lanes. "You should not have been alone out there." For the first time since waking up, the child looked at him not like a stranger, but like someone who might actually stay. The nearest refueling station sat on the edge of the outer drift like a rusted piece of machinery someone forgot to throw away. Port Meridian rotated slowly against the blackness of space, its faded docking lights blinking unevenly through layers of old exhaust and drifting ice particles. The Rust Sparrow eased into Docking Bay 12 with a long metallic groan that sounded painfully familiar to Ethan. "Welcome back, sweetheart," he muttered while shutting down the engines. "Try not to fall apart before I get paid this time." Lyss sat quietly in the co-pilot seat wrapped in a gray station blanket he had borrowed from storage. Her small legs dangled inches above the floor while she stared silently through the windshield at the enormous station outside. Cargo freighters drifted past in slow lines. Neon advertisements flickered against steel walls covered in decades of grime. Compared to the emptiness of deep space, Port Meridian looked almost alive. Almost. "Have you ever been here before?" Ethan asked while pulling on his jacket. Lyss shook her head slowly. Mommy did not like stations near the outer drift. Ethan snorted softly. "Smart woman." The child glanced toward him. "Are there bad people here?" Ethan grabbed the toolkit beside his seat. "There are people here who would sell their grandmother for discounted engine fuel." He paused briefly before adding, "So yes." Lyss tightened her grip around the stuffed animal slightly. Ethan noticed immediately. "Hey, She looked up. Rule number 1. He pointed toward the floor beside him. You stay close to me while we are on the station. No wandering off. No talking to strangers. And absolutely no buying. Mystery meat from hallway vendors. LYSS blinked. What is mystery meat? Ethan started toward the airlock. Nobody knows. That is the mystery. A tiny laugh escaped her before she could stop it. The sound surprised both of them. The docking ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss, releasing warm station air into the ship. It smelled like engine grease, recycled oxygen, burned coffee, and too many people living too close together for too long. Ethan stepped onto the metal platform first while LYSS stayed glued close behind him. Several dockworkers glanced toward the pair immediately. Ethan felt it happen in real time. The looks. The curiosity. A human salvager walking through Port Meridian with a cerulean child wrapped inside his oversized jacket was the kind of thing people noticed. Especially because cerulean royalty did not exactly disappear quietly. Ethan lowered his cap slightly and kept moving. Eyes forward, he murmured to LYSS. Pretend everybody here is boring. They moved through crowded station corridors lined with flickering storefronts and humming ventilation pipes. Somewhere nearby, an old jazz song played through broken speakers distorted by static. Steam drifted from food carts parked against the walls. A repair drone rolled past carrying armfuls of glowing circuit panels. LYSS stayed close enough that Ethan occasionally felt her small hand brush against the back of his sleeve. Then she suddenly stopped walking. Ethan turned around immediately. LYSS stood frozen beside one of the station windows. Beyond the thick glass, dozens of stars stretched across the dark in endless silence. Her golden eyes reflected them softly. What is wrong? Ethan asked gently. The child swallowed hard. It is too quiet. Ethan frowned slightly. Quiet. LYSS nodded without looking away from the stars. When I was inside the pod, there was always noise. Her voice became smaller. The alarms. The shaking. The breathing machine. She hugged the stuffed animal tightly against her chest. But sometimes everything went silent. Ethan said nothing. That was the scary part. The station lights buzzed softly overhead, while distant engines vibrated through the walls beneath their feet. Ethan looked at the little girl standing beside the stars with fear still trapped somewhere behind her eyes. Slowly, he crouched beside her level. You know something? LYSS glanced toward him. Ethan pointed toward the busy station around them. People complain about noise all the time. Cargo haulers rumbled through nearby corridors as if proving his point. But noise means engines are running. He nodded toward the crowded station. It means somebody is still here. LYSS looked around quietly at the moving crowds, flickering lights, and humming machinery surrounding them from every direction. Then she leaned just slightly closer beside him. Not frightened this time, just tired of feeling alone. Ethan rose back to his feet slowly. Come on, kid. He adjusted the strap of his toolkit across one shoulder. Let us go fix my ship before it finally decides to die out of spite. And for the first time since waking up inside the frozen pod, LYSS followed him without hesitation. The repair base smelled like hot metal, hydraulic fluid, and old ozone burns baked into steel over too many years. Ethan lay halfway beneath the Rust Sparrow's exposed engine, housing with a wrench clenched between his teeth, while sparks crackled somewhere above his head. Whoever designed this engine, he muttered around the tool, deserved prison time. Nearby, LYSS sat cross-legged on the bay floor beside an open supply crate almost bigger than she was. She watched him carefully while holding a flashlight with both tiny hands exactly where he asked her to. Her oversized sleeves kept sliding over her fingers every few minutes. You said that about the oxygen recycler too, she reminded him quietly. Ethan reached deeper into the engine compartment. Because I am building a strong legal case. The little girl smiled faintly again. It came easier now. Not fully, not often, but enough for Ethan to notice the difference. Around them, the station repair bay buzzed with noise. Cargo loaders rolled across distant platforms. Welding torches hissed bright blue against metal hulls. Somewhere overhead, an intercom announced docking arrivals in 3 different languages through distorted speakers. The Rust Sparrow sat crooked inside the middle of it all like a stubborn, old animal refusing to die. Ethan finally slid out from beneath the engine with grease streaked across one cheek. All right, he sighed while sitting upright. Good news. We are no longer moments away from exploding. LYSS tilted her head slightly. That is good news. For this ship. Ethan grabbed a rag and wiped his hands. That is practically a miracle. The child looked down at the stuffed animal resting beside her. Ethan noticed she still kept it close constantly, even while sleeping, even while eating. The burned fabric ears drooped sadly beneath the harsh repair bay lights. "What is its name?" he asked suddenly. Lyss blinked. "What?" Ethan pointed toward the toy. "Your weird little space rabbit." She immediately hugged it against her chest protectively. "She is not weird." Ethan raised both hands in surrender. "Apologies to the rabbit." Lyss looked down at the toy carefully before answering. "Her name is Nova." Ethan nodded once. "Solid name." Silence settled comfortably between them for a moment while station workers shouted somewhere farther down the bay. Then Lyss asked quietly, "Do humans always live alone?" Ethan paused slightly while folding the grease rag across one knee. "Not always. But you do." He looked toward the open bay doors where distant ships drifted slowly outside against the stars. "Yeah," he admitted after a second. "I guess I do." Lyss studied him carefully in the same thoughtful way children sometimes looked at adults when they sensed sadness hidden beneath simple words. "Why?" Ethan gave a soft snort. "You ask dangerous questions for somebody your size." The girl lowered her eyes slightly. "Sorry." "No." Ethan leaned back against the ship landing gear. "Do not apologize for being curious." He rubbed one tired hand across the back of his neck before continuing. "Sometimes people get used to leaving." The repair bay noise hummed around them softly. "And after a while," he said quietly, "you stop expecting them to come back." Lyss held Nova tighter against her chest. Ethan instantly regretted saying it the second he saw the look in her eyes. Before he could change the subject, a sharp electronic chime echoed from the nearby terminal screen mounted beside the ship. "Incoming network synchronization." Ethan frowned immediately. "That is odd." He stood and crossed the bay toward the terminal while wiping grease from his hands. The station network had finally finished recovering old data from the escape pod. Corrupted files scrolled rapidly across the screen. Passenger manifests. Emergency timestamps. Cryodiagnostics. Then one file appeared highlighted in red. Priority recording. House Veolyra clearance required. Ethan hesitated briefly before opening it. Static filled the screen first. Then an image slowly resolved through distortion. A woman appeared inside the recording wearing ceremonial cerulean robes dark blue, like midnight oceans. Her silver-white hair fell loose around her shoulders. Elegant features. Violet eyes. Exhaustion written across every inch of her face. Lyss stopped breathing beside him. "Mommy," she whispered. Ethan looked toward the screen again. The woman in the recording glanced somewhere off camera while warning alarms flashed red around her. Smoke drifted faintly through the background corridors behind her. But when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm. "Gentle." "Lyss," she said softly into the recording. "My little star." Ethan felt the entire repair bay disappear around them. Because suddenly this was no longer just an abandoned pod drifting through dead space. It was a mother speaking to her child like she already knew she might never see her again. The repair bay suddenly felt too small for breathing. Ethan stood motionless in front of the terminal while the recording flickered across the screen in unstable bursts of light. Beside him, Lyss stared upward without blinking, both hands gripping Nova so tightly the toy's worn fabric twisted beneath her fingers. On screen, Lady Veolyra looked exhausted in a way Ethan had only seen in soldiers after losing everything worth fighting for. Warning alarms echoed faintly behind her. Somewhere off camera, metal groaned beneath distant impacts. But her eyes stayed focused only on the recording lens. Only on her daughter. "If you are seeing this," she said, softly, "then the stars carried you farther than I could." Lyss's breathing trembled beside Ethan. The woman reached toward the camera briefly, as though trying to touch someone impossible to reach. "Listen to me carefully, my little star. None of this was your fault." The recording crackled heavily for a second. Ethan noticed his own jaw tightening without realizing it. "You were brave." Veolyra's voice grew quieter now. More personal. "Braver than I was." Lyss lowered her eyes slightly. Ethan looked down at the child beside him and saw tears balanced silently along her lashes without falling yet. The recording continued. "I know you are frightened." The woman smiled faintly through visible exhaustion. "You always hated loud storms." Behind her, emergency lights flashed red against polished silver walls. "But I need you to remember something your father used to say." Her expression softened in a way that changed her completely. Not a ruler anymore. Not royalty. Just a mother trying desperately to sound calm for her child. The stars are only dark because light travels so far to reach us. Ethan looked away briefly toward the repair bay floor. Something about the sentence hit him harder than expected. The recording distorted again. Then Valeira leaned closer to the camera. LYSS. Her voice cracked for the first time. Barely, but enough. I looked for another way. I truly did. Silence settled through the repair bay except for distant machinery humming somewhere overhead. But if this message survived, she swallowed slowly. Then I did not. LYSS made a tiny sound beside Ethan. Not crying. Worse. The kind of quiet hurt children make when they are trying not to break in front of strangers. Ethan remained still beside her. Valeira closed her eyes briefly inside the recording before continuing. There is something I need you to know. Her violet eyes opened again. Being loved by you was the greatest honor of my life. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. The repair bay lights buzzed softly overhead, while workers shouted somewhere far beyond the open docking platforms. But none of it reached them anymore. And if the universe is kind, Valeira whispered, someone will find you before the dark does. The recording ended abruptly. Static swallowed the screen. Then silence. LYSS stared ahead for several seconds without moving at all. Ethan could hear the soft ventilation fans inside the terminal, the distant clang of metal tools, the old station breathing around them. Finally, the little girl asked in a voice barely above a whisper. She thought I was alone. Ethan looked down at her carefully. LYSS's golden eyes reflected the frozen terminal screen, now empty except for static. She was scared for me, the child whispered. Ethan crouched slowly beside her level. Yeah, he said quietly. She was. LYSS pressed Nova against her chest harder. But she was wrong. Ethan frowned slightly. About what? The child finally looked directly at him. Her eyes still carried fear, grief, exhaustion. But something else lived there now too. Something fragile trying to survive. I was not alone. Ethan felt the words land somewhere deep inside him before he could stop them. The repair bay suddenly seemed quieter than before. LYSS glanced back toward the dark terminal screen where her mother had disappeared only seconds ago. Do you think she waited for me? She asked softly. Ethan looked toward the stars beyond the docking bay doors. Endless black stretched outside the station walls, cold and silent and impossibly large. Then he looked back at the child standing beside him. Kid, he murmured gently, I think she never stopped. The Rust Sparrow departed Port Meridian 6 hours later beneath a blanket of artificial station fog and flickering dock lights. Ethan sat in the cockpit with one hand loosely gripping the controls while the ship crawled out of the crowded docking lanes toward open space. Behind him, LYSS slept curled sideways across the co-pilot seat beneath 2 thermal blankets, Nova tucked safely beneath her chin. The child had fallen asleep almost instantly after leaving the station, exhaustion finally catching up to her. Ethan glanced toward her briefly before lowering the cabin lights. Good timing, he murmured softly. Because things are about to get complicated. The ship's navigation screen pulsed quietly in front of him. Cerelia Prime sat nearly 36 hours away at maximum safe burn speed, right through disputed outer drift territory, smuggler routes, raider territory, areas where people disappeared every day for reasons nobody investigated too closely. Ethan hated every mile of it already. The Rust Sparrow shuddered lightly as it entered jump alignment. Stars stretched thin across the windshield like silver scratches against black glass. Then the ship dropped into fold space with a low mechanical groan that vibrated through the hull. Everything outside dissolved into flowing blue distortion. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair while rubbing tired fingers across his eyes. He should have transmitted the child's survival to Cerulean authorities already. That was the smart move. The responsible move. But every instinct he had built surviving the outer drift told him the same thing. Trusting the wrong people out here got you killed faster than engine failure, especially when powerful families were involved. He glanced again toward the sleeping child. LYSS shifted slightly beneath the blankets, tightening her grip around Nova even in sleep. Ethan sighed quietly. Yeah, he muttered to himself. I know. A sudden warning chime cut through the cockpit. Ethan immediately straightened. Motion signatures appeared on the radar behind them. 3 ships. Fast. Closing distance. Wonderful, he whispered flatly. The radar display identified no registered transponder codes. Of course not. Ethan reached for the manual controls while the Rust Sparrow's old engines hummed harder beneath his feet. Come on, sweetheart, he muttered to the ship. Do not embarrass me in front of criminals. Another alert flashed across the screen. Incoming communication request. Ethan accepted audio only. Static crackled through the cockpit speakers before a rough voice emerged. Unregistered salvage vessel. The voice drawled lazily. You are entering restricted drift lanes. Ethan rolled his eyes immediately. Funny, he replied while adjusting engine output manually. I was just thinking the same thing about you. A few seconds of silence followed. Then the voice laughed softly. Human pilot. Ethan watched the radar carefully. The three ships continued closing in from behind. Listen carefully, the stranger continued. We scanned your dock departure at Meridian. You picked up unusual cargo. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. Cargo, a cerulean child. LYSS stirred faintly behind him at the sound of voices. Ethan lowered the speaker volume immediately. You have the wrong ship. Do not insult me. The voice remained calm now. Too calm. House Valyra has enemies everywhere. A missing heir returning from the dead would create complications. Ethan's grip tightened around the controls. Outside the windshield, fold space rippled endlessly around the ship in glowing blue waves. Transmit the girl, the voice said quietly, and you may continue safely. Ethan looked toward LYSS again. The child slept peacefully for the first time since he found her drifting through frozen darkness. One small hand still held tightly onto his jacket sleeve, even in sleep. Like some part of her remained terrified, he would disappear if she let go. The radar alarm pulsed louder. The unknown ships were moving into attack positions now. Ethan stared ahead at the swirling fold space corridor stretching endlessly before them. Then he reached over calmly and shut off the incoming transmission entirely. Silence returned to the cockpit except for engine vibration and the low hum of failing ventilation fans. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. Yeah, he muttered while adjusting power distribution toward the engines. That is not happening. Behind him, LYSS shifted slightly beneath the blankets. Ethan, she whispered sleepily without opening her eyes. Ethan softened instantly at the sound of her voice. Go back to sleep, kid. He pushed the engines harder. Warning lights flickered orange across the cockpit. Adults are having a disagreement. Outside the ship, the three unidentified vessels accelerated through fold space behind them like wolves closing through the dark. The Rust Sparrow screamed through fold space like an old engine trying to outrun death itself. Every panel in the cockpit rattled violently, while warning lights flashed orange across Ethan's exhausted face. Behind them, the three unidentified ships remained locked on pursuit vectors, their signatures burning bright across the radar display. Come on, Ethan muttered under his breath while forcing more power into the engines. Just hold together a little longer. The ship shuddered hard enough to wake LYSS fully this time. She pushed herself upright beneath the blankets, golden eyes wide with confusion, while Nova remained clutched tightly against her chest. What is happening? She asked softly. Ethan kept his attention fixed on the controls. Remember when I said there were bad people in the outer drift? LYSS nodded slowly. Turns out some of them own spaceships. Another alarm chirped sharply overhead. One of the pursuing vessels had moved close enough to begin signal interference. Static crawled briefly across the windshield displays. Ethan swore quietly under his breath while slamming one palm against the stabilizer controls. The Rust Sparrow lurched sideways through fold space turbulence. LYSS grabbed the edge of her seat immediately. Are we going to crash? Ethan glanced toward her briefly. Not today. He sounded more confident than he felt. Outside the windshield, fold space currents twisted in glowing rivers of blue and silver distortion. Ethan's navigation screen flashed rapidly while the ship approached the outer boundary markers near Cerulean territory. Just a little farther. Another transmission request forced itself through the comm system. Ethan rejected it instantly. Seconds later, the speakers activated anyway. Human pilot, the comm voice returned. You are making this unnecessarily difficult. Ethan rolled his eyes tiredly. You track me across half the outer drift for a child. For stability, the voice corrected smoothly. House Valyra buried the girl publicly. Entire systems mourned her death. Trade alliances shifted. Political factions reorganized. Ethan's expression hardened. So dead heirs are convenient. Silence settled heavily inside the cockpit. LYSS looked down quietly at Nova in her lap. Ethan noticed immediately. Hey, he said firmly without taking his eyes off the controls. Do not listen to this garbage. The voice continued anyway. If the child returns, entire sectors destabilize overnight. Ethan pushed the engines harder. The Rust Sparrow groaned in protest. Sounds like rich people problems. Human. The stranger's tone lowered slightly now. You are risking your life for someone you do not even know. Ethan stared ahead at the navigation markers approaching through the storm of fold space currents. Then he glanced briefly toward the little girl sitting silently beside him in his oversized jacket. Yeah, he answered quietly. That is usually when it matters most. The cockpit fell silent again except for engine strain vibrating through the hull. Then suddenly the proximity alarm screamed. Ethan's eyes widened. One of the pursuing ships had accelerated directly toward them. Fast. Too fast. LYSS grabbed the side of her seat as the Rust Sparrow shook violently from nearby engine turbulence. Ethan, I know. He worked the controls rapidly. Sweat rolled slowly down the side of his face, while system warnings flooded the dashboard. Structural stress rising. Engine overheating. Navigation drift critical. Ahead of them, a massive silver glow finally emerged through the fold space distortion. Cerulean border gates. There you are, Ethan breathed. Security beacons illuminated the darkness beyond like giant lanterns floating in deep space. Formal military channels immediately activated across the comm system. Cerulean Defense Authority. State identification required. Ethan slammed the emergency transmission switch without hesitation. This is independent salvage pilot Ethan Cole aboard the Rust Sparrow requesting immediate protected entry. His voice echoed through the cockpit speakers. I am carrying LYSS Veolyra alive. Silence followed. Total silence. Even the pursuing ships suddenly backed off their attack vectors. Ethan frowned slightly. Then every cerulean border beacon ahead of them changed color simultaneously from blue to gold. LYSS stared toward the massive lights filling the windshield. What does that mean? She whispered. Ethan looked out at the glowing gates opening slowly ahead of them. Hundreds of defensive cannons rotated into active positions along the border stations. Not aimed at him, aimed behind him. The pursuing ships immediately turned away and vanished into fold space without another word. Ethan exhaled slowly for what felt like the first time in hours. Kid, he murmured while staring at the enormous gates opening before them. I think your people just realized you came home. Cerulia Prime looked less like a planet and more like someone had turned an entire ocean into starlight. Massive silver cities shimmered beneath swirling blue clouds while thousands of airborne traffic lanes glowed across the night side of the world like veins of light. Ethan guided the Rust Sparrow carefully through the atmosphere while every warning alarm on the ship continued begging for retirement. Easy, he muttered while the controls vibrated beneath his hands. Just one landing before you fall apart dramatically. Beside him, LYSS pressed both palms against the cockpit glass in complete silence. Her golden eyes reflected the glowing cities below. Home, she whispered. Ethan glanced toward her quietly. The child looked different already. Not healed. Not completely. But lighter somehow. Like some invisible weight inside her chest had finally started loosening. The Rust Sparrow descended toward an enormous landing platform suspended above the capital district. Cerulean guard ships surrounded them immediately in perfect formation, sleek silver vessels moving with quiet precision around Ethan's battered salvage ship, held together mostly by stubbornness and recycled parts. Well, Ethan sighed while looking around at the escort fleet. This is either a warm welcome or a very elegant arrest. LYSS giggled softly for the first time in days. The sound caught Ethan off guard enough to make him smile too. The landing platform opened beneath them in glowing rings of blue light. As the Rust Sparrow touched down, dozens of Cerulean officials and guards already stood waiting in perfect rows outside the docking perimeter. Tall figures dressed in silver, ceremonial uniforms. Some stared openly at the damaged human salvage ship in visible disbelief. Ethan did not blame them. The Rust Sparrow looked like it had survived a bar fight inside an asteroid field. The boarding ramp lowered slowly with a hydraulic hiss. Ethan stood first, adjusting his worn jacket awkwardly while LYSS remained close beside him, clutching Nova tightly against her chest. Then the crowd outside suddenly parted down the middle. Silence swept across the platform instantly. Lady Veolyra walked forward alone. Ethan recognized her immediately despite the difference between the recording and reality. In the message, she had looked exhausted. Broken. Here, she carried herself like royalty again. Tall, elegant, blue skin glowing softly beneath the platform lights. Silver white hair flowing behind her in the evening wind. But the moment her violet eyes landed on LYSS, all of that vanished completely. Mommy, LYSS whispered. Veolyra stopped breathing for a second. Then she moved. Fast. Not graceful anymore. Not regal. Just a mother running toward her child like the universe had finally returned oxygen to her lungs after 14 months underwater. LYSS ran too. Nova nearly fell from her arms as the little girl collided against her mother's chest. Veolyra dropped to her knees instantly and wrapped both arms around her daughter so tightly Ethan thought she might never let go again. The platform remained completely silent around them except for quiet crying. Neither of them tried to hide anymore. Ethan looked away politely toward the city lights glowing beneath the clouds. Some moments belonged only to the people inside them. Behind him, LYSS laughed softly through tears. "You waited for me," she whispered. Veolyra held her daughter's face carefully between trembling hands. "Always." Ethan suddenly became very interested in inspecting one of the landing lights near the edge of the platform. A few nearby Cerulean guards discreetly pretended not to be emotional either. It was not working for any of them. Several minutes later, Veolyra finally looked toward Ethan for the first time since arriving. Their eyes met across the platform lights and drifting evening mist. Ethan immediately felt awkward in a way surviving pirates had never managed to accomplish. He said intelligently while rubbing the back of his neck. "Your kid is extremely difficult to abandon." Apparently. To his surprise, Veolyra laughed softly. The sound carried warmth now instead of grief. "So I have been told." LYSS immediately grabbed Ethan's hand before he could retreat toward the ship. "He stayed," she announced proudly to her mother. "Even when the bad ships came." Veolyra's expression softened as she looked at him again. Not like royalty studying a salvager anymore. Like a woman seeing the person who carried her heart safely through the dark. "Cerulia owes you more than it can repay," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head once. "Nah." He glanced down at LYSS beside him. "She already paid me back." Veolyra followed his gaze toward her daughter's smile. For a moment, none of them spoke. The city lights shimmered far below while warm night wind drifted across the platform around them. Then LYSS looked between both adults carefully before asking the most dangerous question yet. "So," she said slowly, "does this mean Ethan is staying for dinner?" Ethan nearly choked on absolutely nothing. Several Cerulean guards looked away immediately to hide amusement. Veolyra raised one elegant eyebrow while a faint smile curved across her face. "That," she said calmly while meeting Ethan's horrified expression, "depends entirely on whether your human pilot survives